Hello, and welcome to the Restart Michigan webinar, 6 Imperatives for CFOs Leading Through the COVID-19 Recovery. This is Lori Ostro, Senior Director of Engagement with the Detroit Regional Chamber, and I thank you for joining this session. The Chamber launched this series of webinars to help businesses across the state prepare to start operations and return to work. I would like to thank our guest speakers from Deloitte for volunteering their time to share their expertise. Before we get started, I want to make sure you're aware that all participants are on mute, but you do have the option to submit questions directly to the speakers through the GoToWebinar control panel. I will now turn the webinar over to David Parent with Deloitte.
All right. Thank you, Lori, very much for this collaboration with the Detroit Regional Chamber and the opportunity to do another webinar as part of your ongoing series to provide support to organizations in the community as they respond to various elements of the COVID situation. My name is David Parent. I'm the managing partner for Deloitte here in Michigan, representing our 1,100 people across Michigan, and our office is in Detroit, Grand Rapids, Midland, and Lansing. I do hope all of you are safe and well, including your families, your team members, and so on. I do want to especially recognize those in and around the Midland area who've had the second dose of crisis this week with the flooding there, and I hope all are safe and well and are in recovery mode there as well. We are excited to talk today about finance-specific topics. About 2 weeks ago, we did a webinar on workforce strategy responses around the COVID crisis and the COVID response. And today we will turn our attention to more finance-related topics in this webinar.
Terrific. So thank you.
By my colleagues here in one moment.
Yeah.
Our speakers today from Deloitte, my colleague Ajit Campbell, Dr. Ajit Campbell, leads our CFO program research globally on behalf of Deloitte. And I also welcome our colleague Dr. Daniel Bachman, who is a member of our economist team and specializes in financial and economic modeling, both internationally and domestically. So with that said, I'll turn it over to you.
Terrific. Thank you, David. And thank you all for joining this webinar. I know this is a challenging time. All of us are probably working a lot harder than we've ever worked before. So thank you for spending time with us today. What we want to do are three things. The first is we want to just share some recent findings from our quarterly CFO signal survey and some polling we've done. And the survey was just done over the last 2 weeks. And it gives you the sentiments of CFOs as they think through this crisis and how they're responding. The second thing we'd like to do is share with you some economic scenarios. And Danny, as one of our lead economists in the firm, will share those scenarios and what people are planning to. And thirdly, I want to share some imperatives or considerations for CFOs. And this is based on work we did both in the last recession and in looking at this recession. What are some of the tangible actions that CFOs may want to consider taking as we go through this change? So with that, let me share 2 key findings from our CFO Signals survey. The first finding is really how rapidly people's expectations are changing. We did a poll of about 200 CFOs in April, and then in May, we did our large company CFO survey. And what we are seeing is a shift in expectations of getting back to near normal, literally to second quarter 21 or later, just in the span of a few weeks. So this is still a very dynamic environment for CFOs. And where they are in their planning and response to this, we sort of look at 3 phases in navigating this. The response phase, where you're really still focused on ensuring your company survives and is viable post-crisis. Second is sort of the recover phase, which is adapting your organization to maximize performance during the crisis. And then the third is really moving through to a near normal thrive phase, where you're evolving your business models and capturing opportunities in this as we navigate through this crisis. And you can see still a quarter of the companies approximately are still, in the response phase, and 38% in the recover phase. And that's where management attention is right now. And it's, a considerable number of companies are beginning to look ahead and how they will capture opportunities in this. And we find sectoral differences. Obviously, the hard hit sectors like retail, travel, hospitality, leisure are in the respond recover phase. We're seeing in the tech companies much more of a movement to think about how they go into the thrive phase. So people are experiencing this differently, and in different stages of evolution as they navigate this. With that, let me just turn to Danny to speak to the sort of economic scenarios around this, to which we are all planning. So Danny.
Thanks, Ajit. And as I'm sure you can imagine, there is a little bit of uncertainty in thinking about the economy. As an economic forecaster, I have indeed been changing my views at a speed which is, shall we say, unusual. I've put here a bunch of key factors behind the uncertainty, but the most important one is the one that's all the way on the left: the spread of the disease and how the healthcare system responds. As an economist, I'm basically at the mercy of epidemiological forecasters right now and the epidemiological outcome of the disease. So when I talk about the scenarios that I'll show you in a couple of minutes, and where our thinking is going about the scenarios, much of it involves our thinking about the epidemiology and about how we're handling the disease. But it's not the only problem. For example, in the middle, you'll see the reaction of the global financial system. And when the crisis first hit, that was something I was very concerned about. I thought we might have a 2008 financial market meltdown on top of the pandemic. The Fed has done a great job in preventing that from happening, as far as I can see. So with that, let me turn to our scenarios. In March, we published scenarios that we are currently in the process of updating. And if I can get this slide to advance, or Ajit, if you could advance the slide. Here's GDP under the three scenarios. We knew that there would be a recession, and we still know that there's going to be a recession. The orange line was then our baseline. We had a deep recession with a financial crisis, and we also had what we call long, hard trek to recovery. And to some extent, those scenarios still stand. We now think that the extent of the recession will look more like that financial crisis and deep recession. That's a 15% decline in GDP in 2020. So it's a very, very significant decline. To give you an idea of what this would look like, an average recession in the post-war period has been about 2.1% decline in GDP. So it's a huge decline in GDP. We also think that growth will be a bit slower than we might expect. You'll notice that under none of the cases here do we get back to what might have been the pre-COVID trend. So if you extend with your eyes that green line, you'll see we never get back there. And one of the questions is whether we even get close. So we are now considering a recession like a scenario like the long, hard trek to recovery, basically in which we stay 10% below the pre-COVID trend. And what drives all of these is, in fact, the disease. So the V-shaped recovery people talk about really depends on optimistic assumptions about our finding a vaccine and deploying it. We think those are very optimistic, and more likely we won't have a vaccine or good medical interventions to deploy until at best the middle of 2021. So that means that we are stuck with this situation with a lot of questions. For example, how do we deal with schools? And those things will depress GDP for a while. It's also possible that we won't, over the 5-year horizon we talk about, ever get a good medical intervention, in which case we'll be constantly dealing with outbreaks of the disease. And I know there was one at a Ford plant, right, recently. And those things will keep happening, causing us to shut down different parts of the country at different times in order to keep the disease under control. That's a very pessimistic outlook, but I think it's also a possibility. So next slide, please. Sorry, Ajit. One of the things you should be looking for is for a big decline in GDP when we know about the second quarter. And our opinion is that a lot of economists are underestimating the impact of the shutdown and the pre-shutdown activities of consumers, because even before official shutdowns, consumers were already avoiding food services and accommodations and recreation services. You can see that together that's 8% of GDP. So shutting those down is an 8% decline in GDP. When we add on shutting down a lot of healthcare services, durable goods, and so on, you can see that GDP is going to fall quite a bit. We think it will fall 15% Q on Q in the second quarter. I'm not even going to give you the annualized amount because it becomes not so meaningful. By the way, you want to be careful about the difference between the Q to Q decline and the annualized decline. So you'll see numbers like 30, 40, 50%. That doesn't mean that the economy has shrunk in half. It means that 4 quarters of this would cause the economy to shrink in half. We won't get 4 quarters of decline, but we will have a relatively slow recovery. Next slide, please. In order to reopen, this is, if we can go back for a minute before we see Senator McConnell, you can see this is the AEI plan for recovery. And we are starting to reopen without having actually met any of these requirements, which is, of course, a potential problem. It could give us that particularly bad W-shaped recovery in which we get some activity starting up and then we have to shut it all down again. But it also tells us that there are a lot of reasons why activity just won't recover very quickly. We're going to have to keep a lid on things until we get those medical interventions. So how do we get out of it? Now you can go to Senator McConnell, if you will. Senator McConnell had an excellent differentiation here. The huge amount of money, and I will, as an economist, I will admit that over $3 trillion is a large amount of money. I hope you take that, as it stands. It is a hunk of money, but it is not a stimulus. We are actually, in a sense, paying people to stay home. We don't want people to go back to their jobs as waiters or cooks at restaurants or working in theme parks because we don't want those places open because that's how the virus spreads. So we're paying them to stay home in various different ways. And Senator McConnell pointed out it's emergency relief. That emergency relief will probably be necessary until we have a better handle on the disease. And at that point, the question then becomes, does the economy come back quickly? And in our view, that is not likely. The sort of supercharged boom afterwards is going to be hard to find. Instead, it's more likely to be a relatively slow recovery, people coming back online slowly with high unemployment rates. Demand is going to be low. And at that point, there will be room for a true stimulus package, which will take the form most likely of, if it's most effective, it'll take the form of government spending possibly on infrastructure. The Congressional Budget Office has some data on this, but we might get tax cuts or some other form of encouragement of people to spend, because getting people to spend and getting businesses to spend may prove to be a little more difficult than we realize once we have the disease controlled. So I've lived up to economics as a dismal science, and I'll pass it back to Ajit to maybe talk about finance, which is less dismal.
Terrific. Before I go to finance, are there any questions, David, that we need to address for Danny or otherwise?
Yeah, thank you, Ajit. There are no questions. Just as a reminder to all the participants, you can add questions online in the control area on the right of your screen. There's an area where you can type in questions. We'll pause at a couple different points to answer those real time, or we'll answer questions at the end as well. I also wanted to point out there are 2 handouts available. You can see those and access those under handouts to the right on the control panel, and the research presented here today comes from these materials. Ajit, I'm not seeing any questions, so I'll pass it back to you.
Terrific. Thank you, David. So, as we went through the last recession, we sort of did a deep dive on literally all prior recessions and what did CFOs have to do, and how did companies who navigated the recessions navigate them relatively well. Now, 5 of these things that are in black are pretty straightforward. They're kind of the normal things a CFO has to do during a recession, although these are episodic events. The last one we really went through that was deep, obviously around 2008, 2009. And so the 5 things that are fairly the norm are the bolstering of liquidity. Rethink your communications, whether it's with shareholders or within your organization, and I'll come back to that. What's new in this one is really the need to virtualize as much of your organization as possible. And that creates for CFOs and all leaders new challenges. And I'll come into discussing what some of those new challenges are and some practical actions you can take to better manage and lead virtually. The 4th thing is really continuing to manage your critical risks. And we'll think about what are some of the risks to keep an eye on as we go forward. The 5th, obviously, to manage operational improvements, whether it's to free up liquidity or for other reasons to increase efficiencies. And then the 6th is really to plan for a recovery. And we're seeing different companies in different stages in each of these 6 areas. So let me start with the table stakes, requirement of all CFOs in a recession, with the exception of some very, cash-rich firms in the U.S. And there are a number of firms, primarily in tech, that have had, very large cash and liquidity positions. But from other firms, the challenge is to really bolster liquidity, and that demands almost, a weekly sort of cash flow forecast, rethinking what you, and really recognizing what you have as short-term debt and seeing if you can roll them over to longer-term maturities, potentially drawing down your revolvers. I think what's going to happen in this quarter, especially, will be, as the economic data and the sales data and the earnings data come in, there'll be a need to really renegotiate a lot of covenants, and that's going to keep you a treasurer and you as a CFO very busy if you have debt that's coming due, or you have debt with very restrictive covenants. And then obviously diversifying your financing sources. And the CARES Act creates some sources of funding, and so A number of our clients are looking at how they can leverage those sources of funding to improve liquidity. Another area is to look at, are they tax relief that you can get, through better tax planning, potentially repatriating cash from non-US jurisdictions. And then the other areas people are focused on is inventory and receivables. But what is also becoming very clear is this is putting a tremendous stress across supply chains. And over the last decade, companies have gotten more complicated supply chains and more third parties in their supply chains. So it is becoming more imperative to look at who is your critical supplier set. And do you need, if you're in a reasonably strong position, to bolster the liquidity of some of your critical suppliers at risk? Because if the supply chains go down, your ability to respond to the market, if you have, reasonable demand, is diminished. So both treasurers and CFOs are grappling with all of these issues right now, as we see it in the marketplace. The second area is around communications. These move a lot more quickly than I say, is around communications. And what we're finding is obviously, a CFO communicates closely with their audit chairs, especially in times of crisis. But what we're also seeing is it's become really imperative to team with your chief information officer and chief human resource officer. In the case of this chief information officer, consider if you're doing a virtual close, you need to redeploy the assets of the IT group to focus on making sure that you can comply effectively with regulatory demands and that your IT systems are supporting your staff to deliver on that. Similarly, the CHRO is a very essential partner through this because all of your staff are probably more stressed than before. And, as they virtualize, you are thinking about how do you help them succeed in their roles in a virtual environment. But also, as we're coming back to lifting some of the stay-at-home restrictions, how do you effectively bring staff in a safe way to the organization? So what we're seeing is much more needs for communication and working together across these roles. As somebody said to me recently, the CFO has to almost consider themselves as being responsible for well-being in a way that did not have to before, as they bring staff back to the organization. Another thing has been, do you update, withdraw, or reaffirm existing guidance? Do you stop giving guidance? And we've seen a number of companies who have stopped giving guidance as we go through this period. What kind of information packages do you need to provide the board? But also, how do you communicate internally? As a CFO, you're the second most looked to executive in the organization. And you may need to rethink what your team and internal firm-wide communications protocols are as you go forward. With that, let me turn to the next sort of area, which is to me sort of a foundational change that is going on, which is the virtualization of the company as much as possible and the virtualization of finance. As we said at the outset, we do our quarterly CFO survey that we just, did over about 2 weeks ago. And, our CFOs are saying, even when sites are open, during COVID, 71% of them support remote work if feasible going forward. 72% expect more of the finance work to be done virtually. And, nearly half of them expect a smaller real estate footprint going forward. So some of these changes to virtualization are going to stay post this crisis. What we're seeing is there are sort of two elements to virtualization. The first element is making sure you have the technology to support virtualization. And within that, there are sort of four elements that we see to prioritize around. The first is to implement what are called virtual desktop interfaces. And we found that being very important, especially if you have offshore operations. It might be the case, even if your staff have laptops, their ability to access data from the company may not be easy. And so implementing the technology for virtual desktop interfaces can allow you as an element of control over data access, but also enable your staff, whether they're using their own laptops or the company's laptops or machines, to effectively access critical data. The second thing we've seen is, the cloud is really taking off with these crises, which is cloud-based applications for communication and collaboration have just become imperative. It's like this webinar. Many of us Zoom both amongst our families, but we also Zoom around our work. And so cloud-based applications have created much greater flexibility for communications and collaboration. I know a number of companies have had to implement that in a very short time frame. The third element, especially for larger companies, is to rethink their underlying telecommunications network and move that network from what might be a very physical network architecture to what's called a software-defined network. And the reason for that is it allows you to manage loads much more efficiently on your networks, on your data centers going forward. And then the fourth area is to say, where do I focus on virtualization applications? And most of the companies we are conversing with are prioritizing the customer interaction applications and then a few critical internal operations applications. So those are four areas that, as a CFO, you want to probably converse with your CIO on how you adapt technologically. The other area around virtualization has to do with how you lead through this crisis. And obviously, we virtualized in order to social distance and to take care of our people and ensure their safety. But virtualization has a number of challenges. We lose visual cues, even if we're on a Zoom call or a webinar. You don't see my hands necessarily, for instance. And the Moravian studies, on likability of individuals and so on, showed it was something like 58% was body language, about 32%, if I remember correctly, was voice, and then the remaining 10% or so was, the content, And so without visual cues in the space, it is hard for people to change the way that they normally have processed information about trust, about likability, and so forth. And in some ways, senior executives are extremely good at reading the tea leaves or the nonverbal cues in order to pick up nuances, disagreements, ambiguity, how people are dealing with ambiguity and all of that. And so there's a real risk to decision making that arises if we are not processing these other kinds of cues as we go forward. You know, when I do transition labs for CFOs and I interview the CEO ahead of time, they always say, I want a CFO who looks around corners and can sort of look ahead. And that looking around corners, looking ahead, all of that often occurs due to the informal communications in a firm, which has been disrupted by this event. So here are a couple of things to be aware of and to respond to this. One of the first things is to beware misattribution of intentions to others, because you've lost visual cues. Somebody's coming in late with something. You know, don't attribute something to them because they may not have had the chance to communicate the reason why they're delayed, or, you know, don't fill in your own model of a decision or, you know, in a conversation as to why something is happening. Set really clear purposes to your meetings, and, you know, seek feedback from other people as to how they heard you in that meeting. And, you know, you may also want to occasionally delegate meeting leadership to other people who are probably better at communicating different types of messages. The third thing is it's really important to complement your meetings with one-on-one connections. You know, even if they're short 15-minute or 10-minute calls to people, to really make sure you're getting feedback and understanding into issues. Another strategy that, you know, we found effective is to have what are called team of teams. And Stanley McChrystal articulated that in his book of the same name, which is, you know, put people on your leadership into lower level teams, not to run the team, but to be informed in the team so that signals further down in the organization are migrating to you that are important to your success. Now, you know, we've been working with a number of people on how to effectively virtualize, and Sandy Pentland at MIT was particularly informative in an interview we did with him. And he said there are sort of two things for psychological well-being that is important for people, which is to have someone to talk to and someone they recognize could help them. And this is a period of unusual stress, also for your staff. They're working in a different situation. The boundaries between work and home are obliterated. We find that, you know, NordVPN did a study. People are working about 3 hours longer. A lot of our CFOs say, I've seen greater productivity than before, but at the same time, stress levels are higher. So buddying up people in order to be mutually supportive is helpful, and also buddying up people to complement skills is helpful. So a senior person may not have some of the technological skills working remotely as maybe a more junior staff member would have. So doing that. The last three are also interesting. One is showing appreciation. One of the things we have found, and our researchers have found, is that positive feedback is attenuated down and negative feedback is attenuated up in terms of how people interpret things. So showing appreciation and positive feedback, it becomes more important and to managing stress and performance. And then the other part of this is, as we think about going forward, how do you rethink training and learning remotely for your staff? So these are all leadership considerations around virtualization that a number of people are beginning to engage with now because it has become an imperative going forward. Let me now turn to the remaining sort of imperatives that are, again, fairly normal imperatives going forward. So, one of the role of a CFO is to be a steward of the value of the firm and manage critical risks. And, at this period, you maintain your focus on internal controls and prevention of fraud. As we mentioned earlier, supply chain and third-party risks are probably greater this time around than the last time because our reliance on third parties has grown considerably over the last decade. So there's a lot of attention being paid to these risks and also rethinking supply chains, which we'll come to later. We're seeing more cyber activity, so shoring up cybersecurity, especially during virtualization, becomes important. And then the last category of cascading risk is something interesting, which is when we looked at major individual company value losses relative to other firms and the market, what we often found was one risk event occurred, and then it cascaded to trigger another risk event that the company was unprepared for. So, in this very dramatic disruption, there can be a series of cascading risks that may occur to the firm. So you want to model out what might be some of the cascading risks that could really drive value losses. So the last two things, all CFOs are focused on operational improvements. What's happening within their finance organization, the primary things we're seeing is all the forecasting models they previously had are not necessarily relevant at this point. The assumptions have dramatically changed. And so like Danny spoke to earlier, we're seeing a massive shift to scenario planning and also gathering data from the edge closer to the customers than ever before. And for now, many organizations are rethinking their forecasts and models almost in a brute force using Excel spreadsheets. Normal things, driving enterprise cost reductions, they're rationalizing and diversifying their procurement. We're seeing more consideration for moving the supply chain near shore to the US compared to the past, looking at their pricing discipline, centralizing some of that, and then rethinking the portfolio of assets. What should be kept, what should not be kept. If you think about capital as a constraint, the other constraint is management attention. And, people are looking at, can we reduce some of our portfolio of assets so that we can focus on the areas for recovery, which is our next slide. On the recovery side, what we're seeing is rethinking the product and service portfolio and innovating sometimes for affordability, other times to make it a much more digital service than before. What we expect is a real acceleration of digital transformation to the next normal, whether it's automation of select operations, but really a much greater focus on digital customer experiences going forward. And you've seen a number of retailers pivot to digital retail in the last few months. We're seeing a decoupling of some of the existing supply chains from foreign sources and thinking about how to recreate a much more resilient supply chain that is more local in some ways. And then what we're seeing is sort of a focus on executing inorganic growth strategies going forward. And that's looking at potentially acquiring more distressed businesses and critical assets. And we're also seeing folks sort of using this time to selectively fill critical talent. So it depends on what stage your company's in, respond, recovery, or thrive. But we're seeing companies that are moving to the thrive phase, beginning to really plan in each of these areas. And there is a lot of dry powder out there, especially in private equity, that I think is going to come to the market and drive a number of mergers and acquisition deals as we go forward. So with that, these are the 6 areas that we see CFOs focusing on. Each will be in their own stage at this point, but these are the normal patterns around which one operates to get to recovery. So David, I'll turn back to you, see if there are any questions as we go.
Yeah, we had a few questions.
Sure.
Some of them covered. You just covered one of them, which is, do you expect organizations to take advantage of the high unemployment rate to
Absolutely.
pursue talent?
Yeah, and people are looking at what kind of analytics and those kinds of skills are available that we're really in short supply. Is there an opportunity to shore up certain areas of our finance organization, but more broadly our overall organization at this time?
Yeah, it's probably fair to assume in a economic situation, as Danny described earlier, that there's going to be many organizations that were otherwise high performing.
That's right.
That are to take some workforce actions that they otherwise would not have wanted to or needed to, which there will be some high caliber talent available.
And there may be, people say in certain sectors and industries, my growth expectations in the industry that I'm in and the companies that I'm in have gone down, and they will start looking for higher growth opportunities or recovery opportunities elsewhere. So
another question was, it sounds perhaps from a new CFO, what advice would you have for a new CFO? I guess I'll start on that one. I would probably double underline what you talked about on some of the people elements, budget, both making sure you're very closely connected with your C-suite and your other leaders, because a lot of the decisions that you're analyzing today are even more integrated than in normal, whether it's people decisions or decisions, investment decisions, strategic, and so on. As well as the point on the session we did for the chamber around workforce strategies, we talked about right now being what we sometimes in our firm call a moment that matters. And I think for our people and our organizations at large, and for sure in our specific organizations or specific teams, this is a moment that matters. And our people will remember how we communicated with them, how we put their health priority, and how we really engaged, as well as understood, as you referred to, that different people themselves are going through different ebbs and flows through this crisis. And so double underlining, engaging with your immediate team and your broader organization will probably serve any CFO, especially a new CFO, particularly well.
Yeah. As you know, David, I created our transition lab. So there's sort of 3 critical things for a new CFO to manage in a transition. One is framing the critical priorities for the organization. And right now, some of these imperatives probably are, right? Liquidity, covenants, all that stuff. But the other 2 things that are really critical in a transition are your team and your relationships. And the really hard thing about this virtualization is how do you connect with your team and how do you connect with the critical relationships within the company that you need, right? You have to almost presume instant trust. It's called swift trust. And then, kind of test the team a little bit and get to learn about do you trust the other person to really, are you hearing all the right things? All of those things are really turned on their head a little bit with this virtualization. All your norms, all the skills you developed as a leader are challenged because you cannot connect in person. So those things around leadership that I noted in the virtualization are important. There are some articles that we've done with interviews of people who study leadership virtually in our CFO Insights and our Wall Street Journal series that are very accessible. And those interviews are helpful, and we're continuing to gather ways of how do you work as a leader. I will tell you, it's going to be harder for a period of time because it's going to take more time to connect individually than before. Because you have to make the time. And I think the McChrystal model of team with teams and really working that is just important for you to gather the critical soft information that you need.
And probably overly communicating, not only
Exactly.
as you mentioned, with suppliers, vendors, other third parties. It's a good time to over communicate.
That's right.
Last question that came in, it might vary, I suppose, by kind of sector, but the question was essentially, do you foresee companies that had planned expansion and investment in North America in the near term? Do you think those plans continue, or?
Well, I think as Danny pointed to, some sectors are affected worse than others, and I think it depends on what your model of demand is likely to be, right? If you expect demand to be continuing to grow, you'll probably invest to capture the demand. If demand is likely to contract substantially in your sector, you'd probably put that on hold. So it's a very industry-focused thing. Danny, you may have additions.
Well, I think that just about any industry, there's going to be concerns over the demand issues. So there's two things going on. One is as you shut down, you're just not able to do expansion plans. Construction is still largely continuing, but shipment of machines, for example, isn't happening. So there will be a lot of companies that just have the plans on hold because they can't continue them right now. But as we come out of it, the lack of demand is likely to weigh on a lot of industries as well. Particularly industries, and this gets to your point, Ajit, industries that are at the end or that are going towards those industries that are strongly affected, accommodation and food services and arts, entertainment and recreation. If you're at the end of those industries, that's probably going to really give you pause about where that's going to go. On the other hand, if you're in certain other industries, I know I heard from a maker of recreational equipment, and their April was fantastic, really great. You can't social distance better than to go fishing in a bass boat. So presumably bass boat sales are pretty good. So there are going to be these niches that people pick off. But there is going to be this problem of very low demand and high unemployment. So most of the major things that you do, you're going to probably want to wait to see before you start adding a lot of capacity.
And I do think in some areas, David, I think there are some supply constraints occurring right now. For example, this move to the cloud is driving, a huge amount of investment in that. But somebody's got to make the servers, and the servers need power supplies. And there's a constraint in some, component areas, right? So even if you have a desire to expand, the capacity to expand, there are some inherent constraints that are operating right now.
Okay, a couple questions just came in on the supply chain question.
Yeah.
I'll paraphrase. In essence, there's a fair amount of discussion, perhaps especially in political arenas, about repatriating supply chains to the U.S. Do either of you believe that is really going to happen, or is that more political discourse?
I don't know, but what I do think people are having dialogues about is say, how do we create more resilient chains than we've had before? So can I diversify my supply chain? Do I need to sort of say, instead of having all my eggs in one basket in Asia because it was the lowest cost producer, do I need to have it in other locations? And that's the conversation that I'm hearing. Yeah.
Yeah. So
and Ajit's point is really, really important, that it's not government driven.
It's not government driven.
It's business driven, but it will have an effect on the economy, because what it's going to be doing is at my level, at Ajit's level, you're saying, okay, the organization wants to be resilient. At my level, what it's going to mean is higher costs and lower productivity as we get these more resilient supply chains. Yeah. That will, again, that will probably restrict growth, and by the way, also squeeze profits. In a low growth environment where costs are going up, particularly one where you may not be able to push price hikes, you could well get some profit squeezes out of that.
Okay, probably make this the last one. It's back on the people dimensions. Funny, a group of those interested in some of the people topics. Yeah. Are we seeing any difference of how people have adapted in this new virtual environment around generational differences?
That's a great question. Yeah. So it's I think it's stressful for all groups. And you have your kids at home, and they did that. You're now schooling at home, so there are all kinds of stuff going. But anecdotally, because I don't have strong proof points, we haven't done data collection. But many of the younger folks are ready to get back to the office, and it may be because there's more constrained environments and homes and so on. And, we're hearing from them, they really want to get back. While those who are older maybe have better homes and so on, and have the ability to socially distance in the home, and folks all work in their office area, they have a very different perspective. They may really enjoy this and be able go to a lower frequency of going to the office in the future. So I think it depends on location, sort of what is available to the individual, and how they're adapting to it. I know some of our people have, some of the young folk in New York City are probably going a little stir crazy in their little apartments, right? So
yeah, I think
it varies.
Yeah, I think to summarize, that's the point. It will vary, and it's probably not. It's probably a good idea to be sensitive to that variance.
Yeah, exactly.
And there's a lot of different variables, and showing sensitivity as a leader about some people may feel positive working at home, some not so, and others in between. So being sensitive, listening to those concerns, being supportive one way or the other. Is probably the right leadership mentality.
Yeah. And one of the things we do in our group is we have one of our staff that organizes literally a social call every week with the entire team. And that social call is purely social. They played Pictionary over Zoom the other day, right? And you have these grown people playing Pictionary over Zoom. But it's about connection in a way that maintains the team that's as a whole, and that everybody has a shared experience. And those kinds of things we could previously do over a meal and so forth, we have to recreate that. in this environment. And it helps with stress and as people go through this. So think through ways of enabling your team.
Yeah. All right. I think with that, I will wrap. Thank you, Ajit and Danny, for your presentations today. And thank you for everyone joining. And Lori, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you. Thank you everyone from Deloitte. That was a fantastic presentation. And to the participants, thank you for your time today. You will receive an email from me with a link to today's presentation in case you'd like to share it with anyone else and also review it. Please be sure to visit our website, detroitchamber.com/COVID-19 for upcoming schedules on more webinars from Restart Michigan, as well as our teletown halls and other information that can help you as your business returns to work. I'd like to thank you again for your time today and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.